The Fort St. John Committee of the Whole for September the 11th of 2017. Notice of new business. I have none. Council?
None, Your Worship.
City Manager? Okay. Adoption of the agenda by consensus then.
Aye.
We have the minutes of the September 5th Committee of the Whole.
So moved, Your Worship. Second.
Moved and seconded with no errors or omissions. In favor? Opposed? Carried. And there was no business arising. Presentations and delegation, property standards bylaw.
Jim.
Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Floor is yours.
It's pretty loud.
It is pretty loud. Do you want me to shut it off, turn the other one on?
Sure. How's that? Okay. So what I'm here this afternoon is to bring to council is a bit of a presentation on property standards bylaw, some work that we've done in this area. And so I have a PowerPoint presentation and an admin report with some discussion points in it. So I guess the obvious question is, we're proposing a new property standards bylaw. So the existing bylaws, which are the nuisance bylaw and the unsightly premises bylaw, are both probably 20 years old. So they lack a bit of sophistication, and they certainly lack a lot of specificity to things that we've had to deal with over the years. So that's why we believe it's important to get some clarity into this. Obviously, clearer definitions help bylaw officers, makes their job more efficient and makes them a lot more effective. And a great deal of effort goes into the community from a lot of people to improve the appearance and the livability of the community. So we believe that the proposed bylaw changes would strengthen those objectives. So as I mentioned, nuisance bylaw number 1645 and unsightly premises bylaw number 1223 are the two bylaws that we're looking to replace. And the proposed property standards bylaw will establish and enforce minimum standards for property owners in the city of Fort St. John going forward. So what's new or different? Weeds, grass, and litter orders. We would now have the ability to issue a weeds, grass, and litter order requiring the owner or occupier to remedy the contravention by removing, disposing of noxious weeds, cutting overgrown grasses, and removing and disposing of litter. A lot of that is enshrined in the existing two bylaws I spoke about, but it's not real clear about what it is. And for instance, grass, if you say, what is overgrown grass? What's the standard? You know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In the bylaw, it speaks about 20 centimeters of overgrown grass being the threshold. It can be whatever you want it to be, but that's what we've put into there for discussion purposes at this point. So it's about being really clear about what constitutes things that would require us to give an order like this, because it's an area that if we give someone an order or a property cleanup notice now, those charges can go back and be put on your taxes at the end of the year and recovered. What's really new is more discussion about buildings and structures. So the owner and occupier are required to ensure that any building or structure in their property does not fall into a state of neglect, disrepair, or cause the property to become a safety or fire hazard. A lot of vacant properties, old buildings, some of the ones that you've seen me bring forward over the years for remedial action requirements, this would be able to put this into the bylaw and make it easier to deal with them at that step and not have to go through a very exhaustive process. Boulevard maintenance. So currently boulevards are defined, boulevard maintenance responsibility is defined by Council Resolution 41688 and Policy 106 from 2007, and it states that property owners are responsible for the maintenance of boulevard areas. But it's policy. Okay, nowhere in our legislation does it speak specifically about what an owner is required to do with boulevard. So I believe that's a really important change. people need to understand when we show up and say you need to cut that grass, exactly why it's important. And right of entry, this isn't really new, but it really clarifies in the language about the right of entry for enforcement officers, so it makes sure that people understand why we're there, what we're entitled to do, and what kind of documentation and kinds of things that they're required to produce for us to be able to move forward. So in the offenses and penalties section, we currently enforce under the community charter with remedial action requirements and municipal ticket informations. So we're proposing that this bylaw also get included in the bylaw notice adjudication process that we spoke about a couple weeks ago as an additional tool. So it allows you to be able to use a tiered system of a bylaw notice that would take fines up to $500, an MTI process that would take it from 500 to 1,000, and then a remedial action requirement. So it allows you opportunities and bylaw notice, for instance, for compliance agreements with property owners where you don't necessarily feel you need to give them a ticket, but you do need to get them into an agreed compliance agreement that's going to see them move forward and clean their property up. And I think that's a really, a lot of the bylaws, well, almost every bylaw we have, I believe, should end up in this process in this way. And it'll make enforcement a lot more effective. Primarily because at that bylaw notice level, where you'll be dealing with the majority of your complaints, you'll have an opportunity to have an adjudication process local, that you can work your way through that and not get yourself involved in lengthy processes that may end up in court. You might get there in certain contraventions. What you're wanting to do is you're wanting to limit the amount of times that you end up having to call your lawyer because it's expensive and not always effective. One of the other areas that when we looked at this was we have property owners in the community who simply use the city as an agency to do the work for them on their behalf. So we deal with them recurrently, year after year after year. It's cheaper for them to just pay the ticket for $100 and have the city go through the whole process of cleaning it up and getting contractors and everybody else than it is to look after themselves. And some of the brownfields are particularly because their head offices are in cities far away from here. So the way the bylaw would be structured would allow you to be able to deal with those people and make it prohibitive enough that they'll take responsibility for the property and not just second the city to do their work for them. That will lessen the amount of work, hopefully. So that's the presentation. Try to make it as quick as possible. Any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on boulevards, Jim, if they don't upkeep their boulevards, do we go in and clean them up? I know there are boulevards around town that really need cleaning, although some are really good too.
We use existing unsightly premises bylaw to that effect, but I wouldn't say it is as strong as it should be.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Councillor Christensen.
Thank you, Worship. Thanks, Jim, for the presentation. So there's residential, commercial, no difference?
No.
So they're warned, first of all, then they'll receive a fine, or at the time of warning or notification, is there a timeline put into process so that they have to have their place cleaned up by a certain date, or they're going to get fined, or how does that process work?
So under the existing legislation, what we do is we'll get a complaint and we'll go investigate, take pictures, contact the property owner or the occupier or both, and we'll give them an opportunity to clean the property up. So use a compliance calendar, 7, 14, 21, 30 days, depending on the circumstances. It's been raining, you can give somebody a 7-day compliance thing. If it rains for 5 of those days, then we extend it to 14 days to try to make that as reasonable as possible. So discretion is a big part of that. So there's no specific timelines. You adjudicate every one of them on their own merits. But generally, it's a warning, and if we have recurrent properties or real bad ones, or we get real bad feedback, then we'll potentially put a ticket in place. Putting a ticket in place isn't necessarily the end-all be-all, because if that was the case, nobody would speed. They would just all go 90 kilometers an hour, right? So I think that it really allows you, the process we're outlining allows you more discretion in more areas and the ability to be able to put the effective fines and enforcement parts in where they're appropriate. So that's really the, you know, in some cases, and I give you, for instance, we have some properties in town that historically have had some real problems with hoarding. And the difficulty in dealing with properties of hoarding is that generally there's a mental health issue involved in it, right? So simply giving somebody a $100 ticket or even imposing a remedial action requirement on them isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. It requires a much more comprehensive approach with mental health people, the police, because lots of times they're violent. They're going to redo what you spent a week cleaning up. A week later, it's going to look very much the same. So you need to have as broad a range of tools and be patient in trying to get to the end of the problem. You know, and some of them have taken us years to work on, and I could name several properties that we continue to work on until there's a power of attorney in place, until there's proper supports in place for that person. They might have mental health, Alzheimer's, a whole bunch of things. So we try to look at all those in their own light and make sure that we apply the proper tool there.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation. I don't have any questions. I think we've been looking forward to this coming forward, and we've got the admin report following here. Okay.
So the only one that I can just add a little bit to, the only one that I see is, well, the two resolutions that I put in for resolutions, recommendations that I didn't put in place was, one of the questions that constantly has me scratching my head is regulatory bylaw, to what level of engagement do we need to go to? You know, if you're introducing new legislation, the beekeeping bylaw is a perfect example of that. You're introducing something new in the community, has a lot of different sort of pieces to it. If you're going to a regulatory bylaw and you're happy with the regulations and you're only seeking to clarify the rules of the road, basically, is that an area that we want to go off into? What level of consultation do we want to get into there? Because certainly in, the RCMP don't rewrite the traffic laws as they drive down the highway, right? So the level of input's important for me to understand where we want to go and what kinds of questions we want to ask to the community on these kinds of issues, because they are very regulatory in effect, you know, in their application. And where is the level of discretion that you want to be? Because otherwise we could end up in quite a debate with everybody about what constitutes overgrown grass or a fence that's falling down or something of that nature. So that was really the intent of the two different recommendations I made, is we want to move forward in a regulatory sense, or we want to move forward in a quasi-regulatory consultation basis.
Gotcha. Okay.
Just a quick question.
All right, Councillor Clausen.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just looking at those two recommendations, is the moving forward of this bylaw subject to, is it subject to that confirmation for the province as far as the adjudication thing, or would it happen anyway, I guess is my question, because it says upon confirmation of that.
Well, that's a very good question. And certainly when I look at the, when we put these bylaws, new regulations into effect, my intent would be, if council's amenable to it, is to have them all done at the same time as we put bylaw adjudication in process. The existing bylaws are, even though they might not be as strong as they need to be, whether it be the unsightly premises bylaw or nuisance or traffic or anything, are still effective. They still work, we still can work within those things. Can they be improved? Absolutely. But if you want to lessen the administrative burden on this, then try to move them all at the same place so that you create your bylaw notice, you update your MTI bylaw, and then you bring all the other bylaws, take the schedules out of them, put them into effect in the bylaw notice, MPI, wherever they should land with the appropriate fines in place, and then move forward. And every bylaw you bring forward in the future, then you just put it in the same process. So that would be my intent. I expect to hear back by sometime in November on bylaw adjudication.
So basically, it's just an administrative thing to make it all smooth, do it all at once.
Yeah, we've already done the lion's share of this drafting in the background. My assistant has done yeoman's work in this area in terms of creating the draft bylaws and the schedules and putting them where they belong. There's a bit of work still to do to iron out a few lumps in the road, but I think that we get the bylaw adjudication, then the proper tools will be in place, and it's just about making sure everything lines up appropriately. And so that would be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if there's nothing further, thank you very much. Okay, so council, moving forward on the agenda, number 7, there is no correspondence, and then we just go right to the report. So, as mentioned, there are 2 recommendations, and when I look at this recommendation and I look at the public participation spectrum, now, I felt that the wording is clear, but there may be an opportunity for clarification on that and some feedback. So I thought what we need is a bit of both of these recommendations that were before us. So if we went, so I'll tell you what my thoughts were. Looking at the second recommendation, that upon confirmation from the province of British Columbia that the application for inclusion in the bylaw notice and adjudication system has been approved, council directs staff to bring forward the amended municipal ticket information bylaw, bylaw notice bylaw, and the property standards bylaw for the first 3 readings. And after that, to hold a public meeting for feedback from the community.
Agreed, Your Worship.
Not
Just one
the
meeting?
not the consultation
Pardon me?
piece.
One public meeting?
That's what we've done in the past with
So
our
not
budget.
online or-
Right.
just
Well,
one.
it's, I really think that this is clarifying what we have. This is taking existing bylaws, modernizing them, and just bringing them up to date.
Yep. I will make that recommendation.
I'll
Okay.
second it, Your Worship.
Moved and seconded with that amendment, and that's doable. Yeah, okay. Any further discussion?
No, Your Worship.
In favor? Opposed? Carried. And back to the agenda, there is no new business or resolution to go to a closed committee of the whole, so we are adjourned.